Hi, everyone. Thanks for checking out the Safe Travels podcast. My name is Joey. This is our final episode in our series at Petrified Forest National Park, and I'm honored to be joined by park ranger and museum curator Matt Smith. Matt and I talk all about the art and science of museum curation. We also dive deep into the collections here at Petrified Forest National Park. Matt, we are in the collections room at Petrified Forest National Park. You are the museum curator, and I'm thrilled to talk to you about everything that you have on the table behind us and on the drawers above you as well.
Sure, yeah. No, excited to be here. Thanks for inviting us.
You are a lover of paleontology, and you grew up in Florida, so where did that love for paleontology start?
Man, yeah. So when I was a little kid, maybe 2 or 3 years old, we had this Airedale Terrier that would dig underneath the foundation of our house. They were just crazy diggers. And so my family decided to get a big load of gravel delivered so that we could spread it out around the foundation and maybe stop her from digging as much. But as a 2-year-old, we're obsessed with like climbing up things and down things. And as I was doing that, in that gravel, I found a really weird looking rock. I picked it up. And my parents realized that it was a fossil horse tooth, right? So we went to our local museum, the Florida Museum of Natural History in Gainesville. And yeah, the guys at the front desk were super excited, and they called up one of their paleontologists from downstairs in the fossil collection range down there. And this guy was Dave Webb. And he was a sort of grand old gentleman of paleontology, much younger back then. But he came up, and as he was wont to do with pretty much any person, child or otherwise, who came into the museum throughout the years, he very engagedly told me what it was, why it was special, made me feel special, made my parents super excited. And then that never really left me, right? And then when I went back there for my undergraduate degree, I had no idea he'd still be around, but I saw him again. And, I was kind of like starstruck as a much older young man. All those years later. And, he finally passed away not too long ago. And, rest in peace, Dave. So
you bring up a really interesting point with that story. We can talk about science all day long, but there's a difference between a really good scientist that is able to provide good science, but then also have that aspect of scientific communication with the public and young kids like yourself. How important do you think it is to have that leg of communication to be able to inspire young people like yourself at that time?
100% critical. So in my view, and the view of other museum professionals as well, I see museology and conservation and all that being this sort of three-legged stool. You've got research, obviously, learning the stories that we share as one of those legs. You have preservation and conservation. We have to keep these things in their best physical quality for as long as we can in perpetuity, right? And then you have outreach. And if we don't share the stories or engage people with the objects that we conserve, then what are we here for, right? And so it's so important that we, live to inspire not only, new curators and new museum professionals, as kids when they come to see us the first time, but the entire American public, right? And we're here in the national parks as sort of living museums, right? They were set aside with the Organic Act back in 1916 to conserve the natural and cultural objects therein. And part of that was for the really fragile things, bringing them indoors and taking care of them where they are less likely to be destroyed, stolen, or, abused in any way.
What pride do you take in being the curator at this park? I mean, this park is really one of the meccas for paleontology as part of the National Park Service. So to be able to curate the many items that are behind us and around us, what pride do you take in that?
All the pride. I mean, I could live out my career here. I feel like there's many more lifetimes of stories to learn here. And since I've been here for 16 years, we've seen lots of grad students come and go, start their academic sort of self-discovery journey here, and tell all kinds of new stories about new creatures, new plants, new everything that we find here in the park every year.
Paleontology as a child in Gainesville, Florida. When did museum curator come into the picture for you?
Good Lord. I didn't think I would ever do this, honestly. Because I have a very sort of non-traditional educational background. I never went on to get a master's or a PhD. And I feel like a lot of imposter syndrome because of that. But I fell in love with the physical conservation aspect of that three-legged stool, right? Fossil preparation and conservation is a skill that until very, very recently wasn't taught in any colleges. Even now, there's no degree in that specifically that you can get in the United States. There's coursework now at a few universities, but nothing really kind of angled towards that. And so it was really much more of an apprenticeship kind of thing. And so as an undergraduate at University of Florida, my family was very poor. And so work study was a big part of my academic package. And I was able to work with Russ McCarty, who was the preparator at the Florida Museum of Natural History, as a job. I was getting paid. And all of a sudden, as an undergraduate. And, I had the physical hand skill and manual intelligence to really do that sort of work. And, I fell in love with it. And I started to realize that, being from a poor family, grad school was going to be a reach for me. I also had dyslexia and other issues that made it a little bit more difficult to pursue a purely academic path. And so I figured I'd just be poor and childless and do fossil preparation because, museum support staff generally aren't paid as well as academic paleontologists, curators, etc. And so I set off after, my undergraduate degree, just wanted to get more experience. So I worked at the Smithsonian. I ended up working, at the Florida Museum again, like returning home several times, sort of post-academic career. I ended up working with the American Museum. I ended up, just kind of bouncing all over the place for a little while before I settled into the National Park Service. I didn't even think of the parks as a career opportunity, right? I didn't know that they did paleontology, like from stem to stern, from the field work all the way up through the storing and care of all these things. So, I just sort of leaned into it and, made a place for myself in the National Park Service. And they kept recognizing my work and promoting me. And so I walk the walk now with the staff we have here. I partner with them and write academic papers and do all the things a normal paleontologist would do. But yeah, I just don't have those fancy letters in front of my name. And, maybe one day, I've known paleontologists who've gone back and gotten their degrees very late in life. It might be something I do, before I retire. That's an aspiration, I guess you could say, but I don't know.
I know imposter syndrome is really easy to fall into, but
yeah, it's horrible.
Personally, though, I feel like your story is really inspiring. And I think it's really important for people to hear because you don't always need the fancy letters in front of your name to be able to have a successful career, to be able to inspire people. Do you incorporate that into your mantra when you're speaking to young students?
Absolutely.
That are trying to get into this field, that maybe they don't need to go that full route to be able to find success?
I do it here at the park. I do it at professional society meetings. I often talk, a lot of young folks want to know how to get into federal jobs in paleontology and things like that. And my general advice to them now is go ahead and get that master's at a minimum. Go ahead and get the PhD if you're so inclined. However, there may be rare individuals who can, sort of matriculate into the job force without any of that. I just wouldn't advise it because it is so much more part of the requirement for job postings these days, right? I was sort of in the right place at the right time. There were a lot of old school preparators, retiring or expiring around the time that I was coming into the job market. And so I attribute a lot of my success to just pure, beautiful stochastic luck. And one of the things that I love to give back is, here in the national park, we can go from the grave, where these animals died, to the cradle, like the support cradle behind us here, all in one place. There's so many places in universities and things like that where you literally can't go out the back door and go find museum quality fossils and then take them through every curatorial and conservation step, right to building exhibits and things like that. And so we can do all that here. And so anytime I can nurture a up and coming paleontologist here, I'm all down for it.
You mentioned your journey getting to the National Park Service. Now that you're obviously a part of it and have been a part of the NPS for a number of years, what has your journey been like through the NPS?
Yeah, I mean, it's had its challenges. Again, with that lack of degree and all that sort of stuff, I was told by, some colleagues in the NPS that I would never, reach a certain pay grade and things like that. And so I lived beyond their expectations for me, I think. And then I've had people who were equally mentors, and really kind of held my hands and inspired me. And, when I would get down in the mouth, they would help pick me back up, And so, yeah, it's been a place of challenges, but also a lot of inspiration.
What other parks have you worked at or done details at?
Yeah, John Day, Fossil Beds National Monument up in Oregon. And that's about it. I think resource folks tend to stick the landing and stay at parks a lot longer than a lot of other fields in the National Park Service because it's such a heavy intellectual investment. It took me 2 or 3 years to even kind of get up to speed. Because I went from the age of mammals to the very beginning of the Mesozoic, where everything was weird. And so it took a good long time for me to even feel comfortable with a lot of the tales that we had to tell, the science we have to do. And yeah, why leave now?
Off camera, you told me that you believe museum curation is a science.
Sure.
Why do you believe it is a science?
Yeah. It's a science, but it has to be informed by art. It's a science because there's so much about material conservation. We bring these things in from the field where they've been weathering under the sun, and there's like lichens growing on them, or they've been torn apart in our expanding clays, and things like that, like fossils just being shredded into little fragments and pulled apart by wetting and re-wetting and freezing and thawing and all this sort of thing. And so knowing how to best put those together so that in 20 years, somebody isn't having to possibly destroy them, removing an adhesive or, a molding compound or some kind of contaminant from these that I ill-advisedly applied to them, is a huge issue in the field, right? And there's, of course, people who specialize in this conservation science, art conservators and things like that, who will hop into natural history conservation or organic object conservation or paper conservation. There's all these fields that tie into good museum curation, and they're primarily from the sciences. Now, we may be taking care of art, the Mona Lisa, or some other 3D object, three-dimensional object like a sculpture or a marble or something like that. But, we're looking to keep those in the best form possible in perpetuity, right? An ancient Greek marble that is 1,000 years old needs to last another 1,000 years in our care. So it is a science.
When we're specifically talking about dinosaur bones
Sure.
or fossils, what's the balance between the science that a paleontologist needs to do on those bones and the care that needs to be taken for you to be able to receive it, preserve it, and potentially put it on display, or just have it protected for generations to come?
Yeah, it's a whole process. So there's the field work that's done, and how to best get the stuff out of there and to a lab to be worked on, and that's done in field jackets and all that sort of thing. These little plaster eggs that we cradle the objects in temporarily, and then there is the process of removing all the matrix, stabilizing the specimen, making sure it doesn't fall apart. Casting, molding, replicating, 3D scanning, all that stuff can be done somewhere along that journey. And then, is this something that reads well for the public if you want to put it on display? A lot of the fossils we get are so tiny or so fragmentary that to the layperson, they'll look at it and be like, Shmeh, it looks like a rock or whatever. And so how do we bring that to life, right? Through visuals, that we install around it, which takes a certain amount of art, or, something to sit there and instead a cast or a mold or a 3D print or something like that. How do we tell the stories that the fossil represents?
Is there ever a time when a paleontologist discovers a fossil and the fossil needs to be kind of taken apart or dismantled in a way for them to be able to study and understand what it is, to the point where maybe it doesn't come to you anymore because it's so fragmented?
They'll always be with me, right? Because we are the safe house of the stories that we can tell in the park. Like, this is where things will land ultimately, one way or the other. Now, depending on the museum you're in, there's parks all over the country. There's 400 plus park units. Over 200 of them have fossil resources. So over half, have fossils of some kind. However, within the Park Service, there's a very few that have enough paleontology staff to care for them, as I said before, from the cradle or from the grave to the cradle. So, Petrified Forest just happens to be one of those places. And I think that, we've uniquely situated ourselves as being able to care for it through every step. And if anything, we get fossils from other parks that need the level of care that we can provide for them. So we generally don't send things away. We do collaborate with universities, obviously, right? And they'll take something on loan for an extended period of time while a researcher describes it, or a doctoral student goes through the process of getting their PhD based on our materials and things like that. So it'll be gone 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, even 20 years sometimes, but eventually it'll come home.
I've had the pleasure of spending a couple of days with you now and chatting with you. One really cool and interesting thing you told me is that as humans, we typically break history into fragments, specific parts on a timeline, rather than looking at the continuity of our timeline as a whole. And I think that goes well into museum curation, because some of the items that you have behind us are modern day animals that we can find in the park. What role does that play in displaying the dinosaur bones that everyone's curious about versus the present day of Petrified Forest?
Yeah. So, one of the questions we get asked most frequently when we're doing public demonstrations about this work is, well, how do you know that's a dinosaur bone? How do you know that's a frog bone? How do you know that's a snake bone or a lizard bone or whatever, right? And so paleontology is, cemented together with modern biology and biological sciences. And so having a good comparative collection for things that you find from the fossil record, and they're fragmentary, they're obscure. It takes a fine eye to be able to figure out, based on that scant anatomy that's left in good condition, oh, this is a frog, right? Our paleontologists, like Adam Marsh, he can work from little crumbs, but a lot of museum professionals who are doing the support roles that I was talking about earlier also have a fine eye for this kind of stuff. And so having the modern collections here really helps us out when we do have a head scratcher and we need something to really get our hands on in 3D and look at and compare.
Is that part of the storytelling as a curator, to tell the public this is what existed in the past?
100%.
These are the evolutionary traits our modern day species have taken on?
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the best things about working in the Triassic, is that we're working at the dawn of the ecosystems that we're familiar with now, right? So much of what came in the Permian would be so unfamiliar to modern day naturalists or nature enthusiasts, park travelers. And the Triassic is like the birth time and place of frogs, of turtles, of, early mammals, of dinosaurs, which of course still live with us today as birds. Basically all the things that we're familiar with in the landscape today have their origin in the Triassic, if not maybe a little bit further back, but that's the challenge, is finding them back into the Permian, back into earlier time, right?
What's the art or science of storytelling when you do decide that the public should see this item in a museum or on display? What is that process like? Do you consult with paleontologists or other staff resources here to figure out the storyline that goes out to the public?
Yeah, it's very, very collaborative. And our paleontology staff, our interpretive staff, they're all kind of involved with it. And we go through multiple rounds of feedback and sort of, we mock it up, set it up. Everybody gets eyeballs on it. They give their feedback. Sometimes, myself or others want to be too nerdy and talk about a thing too much, and you only have this much room for text. And so, how do you balance that? And visual storytelling is so much part of that. Having artwork that tells as much of the story as you can, working with paleo artists who, can, through the fossil evidence that we have, bring those landscapes back to life, in consultation with the paleontologists, paleoecologists, climatologists, all that sort of stuff.
I imagine that's a blast, being able to recreate those scenes.
Yeah. It's what we live for. Yeah.
And how often do you get to do that part of the job where you're recreating artwork from the past?
We try to zhuzh up our exhibits probably once every 5 or 6 years, and if not do a whole new exhibit, then at least, make sure that all of our academic information in the exhibitry is still up to date. And we try to make them easy to replace, the panels, the graphics and things like that, so that it's, relatively cheap and non-impactful to take them apart and rebuild them, so that we can always stay up to date.
Are there ever times when you receive a fossil or some artifact or relic that goes on display, you believe you have the history, the artwork drawn up to what is accurate, and then you make another discovery months, years later that might go against what you put out, and have to redo that?
Yeah. We have things like that where, we think we're on the right track, and then we find out, that actually doesn't belong to that group of animals. We have better evidence now that it belongs to this or that. Luckily, we haven't made too many of those mistakes here in the park. Like I said, we have a really good paleontology staff, but we also have had, in my time here, a lot of sort of like Kevin Costner, if you build it, they will come sort of moments, or, like when I was a kid watching like Ultraman, TV shows and Saturday morning or whatever, there was this one thing where like a kid would draw a monster on a wall and it would come to life. We have that happen here, where we employed a muralist to paint a scene from the Triassic, and he's like, well, in Italy there's these pterosaurs, can we add one of those to the mural? And we all kind of hemmed and hawed, and we're like, well, we haven't found one in the park yet. And then a few years later we do. There's these weird little things that we sometimes jokingly call monkey lizards. They're actually called trypanosaurs. We had never found any fossils of those in the park. And then that went into the mural, and lo and behold, a few years later, we found those as well. So I don't know. I kind of feel like maybe I need to work with more paleo artists and just like get a whole bunch of like conjectural art made and then just see what shows up.
Is there a fine balance between science and storytelling when it comes to curation and what you're telling the public?
Yeah. Our paleontologists are incredibly accurate. That is their job, to describe things through the scientific lens as minutely as possible, And to do so, they use a very particular vocabulary that leaves many people's heads spinning. And so to bring their language to life is more of the art side of things. And that's what our interpretive staff help us with. But yeah, I feel like finding things that are relatable is that first step. And a lot of that goes into the arm wavy part of the science, right? And, at scientific meetings, arm wavy is almost like a 4-letter word, but it is what engages the public, right? And so you have to throw a little bit of charisma in there. You have to throw a lot of good story formatting in there, a lot of, but therefore, sort of like good story structure helps. And so, it is a science to itself.
We've talked primarily about wildlife so far and dinosaurs.
Yeah.
Petrified Forest National Park is the only national park that preserves part of Route 66. The Butterfield also went through here. There's incredible human history, including associated tribes that have called this home since time immemorial.
Yep.
I imagine that
story to that line.
And I imagine that storytelling process when it comes to ancestral history is vastly different, because the truth is a lot of that story is theirs to tell and not necessarily the Park Service's.
Correct. Yeah. And we didn't always treat it that way, right? That's one of the things that we could learn to do better and are actively working on, I think, across the Park Service. And so we have been in the last decade or two, I think, trying to better address the continuity of the people here on the landscape. And, we have evidence of occupation here in the park that dates back to at least 13,000 years ago. We have evidence that is just, tens of years old, right? Of, the native peoples who have, fostered this place through time and cared for it themselves as well. And so, we're hoping that our stories continue to become more collaborative and tell a more and more complete story.
When you receive an animal, let's say a modern day animal that you get to preserve, do you have a sense of responsibility to...
it's a tiny little life.
Yeah, to take care of that life and then to display it properly for people to learn from?
Sure. Or, store properly, right? So that academics can learn from it. Somewhere back here, I've got something I can show you. One of the things that's going on in the park is a multi-park process monitoring for the spread of white nose syndrome, which is a fungal disease that's spread among bat colonies now. And it's devastating a lot of their populations, and bats are key to our modern ecology. They are great insect control. They help our farmers. They help, us in our suburban neighborhoods, like not have to smack ourselves in the face every 5 seconds. When it comes to mosquitoes and things like that. And so this is a very flighty kind of bat. It's very sensitive to disturbances in its cave ecosystems and things like that, or its roosting sites. This is a Townsend's big-eared bat. And we didn't have one in the collection when I got here. And so during one of these studies, our biologists handled over, I think, 120 bats or something like that in just a couple of nights. And during that process, this one did pass away. And we don't know why. There was no obvious physical damage to it. It didn't have white nose syndrome. But, it may just be because these guys are so high strung. And maybe this one was older. I don't know. But it passed away, unfortunately. And so rather than letting this individual go to waste, we decided to go ahead and curate it. I haven't done the full process. I haven't cataloged it into the collection yet. But I sat in our demonstration lab where we do work in front of the public, and I skinned it and stuffed it and mounted it to dry. We don't use any chemical preservatives these days. And so our job is just to keep it away from any kind of insects and things like that might damage it. It's its own little unique life that we've honored as much as we can by trying to preserve it.
I love that you say honored.
Yeah.
Might seem like an obvious question, but can you describe a little bit more what you mean by skinned and stuffed it?
Sure, yeah. It's, grizzly, but we very carefully open up, the ventral side of the animal and then start kind of peeling the skin away. And, the bones in the arms and legs are still in there. So you sort of move the skin back and away, say down the leg until you get to the knee joint or maybe just above that. And then you break or cut the bone, and remove as much muscle mass from inside the rest of the leg as you can, because you don't want that, festering or rotting and destroying the skin. And so really all you want is bone and skin as much as you can left in there, because that dries out relatively nicely under the right conditions. So we try to do a fairly good job, doing climate control in our buildings and keeping everything dry and cool. And so it'll last for a long, long time without any kind of preservatives or anything like that. So then when I stuffed it, you add just a little bit of cotton fiber back into the body. You try to bulk it out so it has the same general proportions. We measure it to make sure that we have all the body's, head, trunk measurements right as we stitch it all back together. And then you just pin it out or, kind of lay its arms alongside itself, depending on what you want to do with the skin, and let it dry.
It's really interesting to me because if there's any part of the process that's messed up, this is your really one opportunity at the moment to do that, right?
Right. It's unique. We may not see another one of these come into the collection because we only take advantage of, accidental, window strikes or car strikes or, animals that die of natural causes while we're handling them or something like that. So I may not have another chance like this for another, 20 years.
And do you feel pride in knowing that even though this animal had passed away, you're going to be able to tell its story and other people are going to be able to learn about this species because it is now used as an example?
For sure. And the other thing that we can do, we work in collaboration with other museums around the country. We can do tissue storage, we can do DNA storage and things like that, where we can look at, liver tissue or kidney tissue or one thing or another. We could send it off to the Fish and Wildlife Service to do a necropsy to see why it may have passed away. There's all sorts of things that we can conserve from this beyond the skin and skeleton. So.
I don't want to get so emotional about these animals or your job, but do you think it's important for a curator or a person in your position to be able to learn the story of the animal that you're handling or how it passed away or the environment that it's supposed to exist in?
Yeah. I mean, there's story and there's, sort of capital S story, and then there's the lowercase sort of science story. To science, in some cases, this is a single sample, it's very clinical. But to me, as a person who's conserving it and preserving it, I spend many hours with it, going through that process, which is invasive and a little bit scary. And I get sort of emotionally attached to them. With the fossils, right, because I'm removing them from rock, it takes hundreds of hours. This was over and done with in a half a day. But with the fossils, it may be, 20, 30, 40, 1,000 hours to get a particular set of bones out of the rock. And then you see the wear and tear that animal's picked up throughout its life reflected in its skeleton, broken bones, lost teeth, arthritis, disease, all that sort of stuff. And then, because you have all that time, our human minds drift off into story, and you start to see the day that, that fractured jaw healed, right? And it was able to feed itself again and not depend on its, social network, its parents or siblings or pack to help care for it. And you feel that, in your bones. So yeah, it can get emotional.
You bring up an excellent point that I've never really considered that much. I'm curious your take on this, but you bring up this being a form of conservation.
Yeah.
And I think typically a park goer, myself, thinks of conservation as preserving what's currently out there, what's live, restoring the landscape. But in your view, and really just in reality, this type of work is also conservation.
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, I mentioned art conservation earlier. We can care for the things that, people have produced throughout the centuries. We can, care for, animals whose remains come to us. We can care for the landscape itself. It's all part and package of this thing where we are trying to, respond to changes in the environment, changes to the specimens, and push the odds that are against them more into being in their favor, right? Can we reintroduce, wolves to Yellowstone, or, ferrets to Petrified Forest? Or can we, make sure that insect pests don't attack these skins and destroy them in the decades or hundreds of years that we care for them? And, it's all part and parcel of the same idea of protecting, the world around us.
You've brought out a number of displays around us. If you don't mind sharing some of the amazing artifacts that you have. You have some dinosaur bones and fossils here.
Yep.
And I know you have stories associated with all of this, so I'd love to hear some of it.
Sure. Yeah. So, we have every kind of fossil you can imagine here at the park. This is a sort of oily brown liquid that's lying in the bottom of this tiny little vial. It is actually fossil pollen. It's just their little carbon skins that are left over. But a scientist in Perth, Australia, digested this rock, typically in some kind of acid, and retained the organic materials that were left behind. So it's a sort of stew of pollens and spores and all sorts of things. So this traveled to Perth for that process. Somebody analyzed it there. They published a paper on it, and then they mailed it back, and it went all the way to Los Angeles, got lost in the whatever their shipper of choice was, went all the way back to Perth, Australia, and then they shipped it a second time and it got to us safely. So this is literally our best traveled fossil. It's been around the world twice, like the entire circumference of the world, so it's kind of amazing that there are paleontologists that specialize on the story of plants and their tiniest parts, right? And whole species are described just from pollen. Other things like this is a holotype. It's just a jaw of an animal that's related to both dinosaurs and, crocodiles and alligators and things like that. It's a archosaur amorph. And they're weird. Animals like this were really only known from Madagascar, India, other parts of Africa, and things like that until relatively recently. We discovered that we had them in North America. It's around about 2014. And then a slew of scientists kind of collaborated with staff here at the park to write papers about this animal. And, the paper about this particular species was kind of headed up by our park paleontologist. So this is a new species to science. This is what's called a holotype. This is the physical representation of that species, right? Like if this gets destroyed, that species ceases to exist. So, that's a kind of amazing story. And, caring for it is a tricky business. It's super thin. If I were to pick it up and hold it up to the light passes through it. It's literally paper thin in places. And so even handling it can be tricky, much less, doing the work our paleontologist does of, digging it out of the ground and getting it to us safely, right?
Well, I have to ask you one thing about that. You just said, if that were to get lost, the species ceases to exist. Mm-hmm. So in your view, even if an animal physically on this planet living is extinct, it still exists if we have the artifacts display.
Right. Exactly. So it's been going on since the 1700s. Carlos Linnaeus in Sweden started this process of describing species with a Latin, binomial. Binomial nomenclature, right? It's Homo sapiens for humans, things like that. And so for every species in existence, there's some sample, a skeleton, a skin, a DNA sample, a tissue sample, something like that exists in a museum somewhere. That is the physical representation of that species. It's what's described in a scientific paper. And if that gets destroyed, that species ceases to exist until a new sample can be procured, a new representative of that species can be described and accepted by the international, oh God, I'm going to butcher this and people will laugh at me, but it's like the International Board of Zoological Nomenclature, that says, yes, we agree that it is that species. And, we think that the publication that you've written to explain that that is legitimate has been accepted and peer reviewed and all that process, right? And then, Paracasuchus trevorum will live again, right? So, yeah.
That's quite the responsibility you have.
It's crazy. It's literally nuts. So, yeah. Other things that we have up here are things like this tooth. Like we have a pretty good idea of what animals that thing is related to. This is a single tooth. The other tooth that matches it is at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. Both were found within 20 miles of where we sit now. This one was found in the park. And it has a name. It's Curator species Colberti, named after Ned Colbert, who worked here in the park. And basically, yeah, I mean, this thing is ridiculously rare. There's only 2 of them in existence. And it's so weird that we don't even know what order of animals it belongs to. It could be a fish. It could be a turtle tooth. They don't have teeth now. It could be some kind of mammal-ish reptile. We just don't know. And until we find this in a jaw, or with, the rest of a skeleton or a skull, we won't know. Like we just need more evidence, right?
What's the likelihood that you find the jaw structure with that tooth?
It'll probably happen one day or another. That's what, our paleontologists and our, seasonal staff do every year, right? They go out and they look for more evidence, and it's a continually growing science. So it'll happen.
That's amazing. I'm sure it's a big party when that happens.
Yeah. Another animal that we have are things like in here. So this is a skeleton, partial skeleton of a little creature called Reveltosaurus calendari. It would be 2 or 3 feet long, kind of like the size of a medium-sized dog. And basically, this is the most complete skeleton in existence as of now. There's other similarly complete skeletons, but this is the only one that's articulated. And so all the ribs are in place, all the armor up and down the back is in place, the legs are here, upper leg bones, lower leg bones, toes. And we have the rest of the skeleton in this drawer over here, including a skull with, teeth in it and everything. And initially when teeth of this animal were found, a lot like that one, it was thought to be a very primitive plant-eating dinosaur. And so researchers at another university described it as the world's oldest plant-eating dinosaur at the time. Paleontologists got super excited, like, woo, origin story, we like that. But then in the end, when we found complete skeletons here in the park, starting in about 2004, as soon as we saw the ankle bones and hip bones, we had to do a 180, and be like, oh, not a dinosaur. So we robbed the world of a dinosaur. But then we were stuck, our scientists here were stuck trying to figure out, well, what is this? And so through the whole process, we redescribed the anatomy of the entire creature. We realized that the ankles and various parts of the body were much more sort of crocodile-like than dinosaur-like. So it is a relative of crocodiles and alligators, more specifically a group of them called aedosaurs. And even among aedosaurs, it's an oddball. So it's sort of, if we really stuck with that Linnaean taxonomy, it would probably be in its own little subfamily called Reveltosauridae. But now we do phylogenetic analysis, which splits things up much more finely than Linnaeus did back in the 1700s, kingdom, order, phylum, blah, 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 right? So yeah, it's an amazing little story. It started out with a single tooth, right? But then we found everything else. So
it's so cool to see the images behind us of it actually built out, and to try and imagine that in the landscape we see
the
today.
Little critter scurrying across the wall up there behind us. And then some of the things that we look at are even tinier. So this is a little jaw fragment, again, a holotype. of a creature called Fungus vermis gilmori. And it is related to a living group of animals today called caecilians. And it's, like half a centimeter long, and it has maybe 20 or 30 teeth in it. It's minuscule. Caecilians are related to frogs and salamanders. They're the third big group of living amphibians, but people in North America or, a lot of the temperate zone don't really know about them because aside from some that are exotic invasives in the canals of South Florida, they don't live here in the United States. But they're all over the tropics, and there's over 200 species, but they all live underground. And so they're super rare. They only come out because of weird events, like flooding rains or something like that. And they live these really secretive lifestyles underground. And before finding these fossils, which we have like over 100 of now, there were only 12 caecilian fossils in the world throughout the entire history of their existence, right? So they had like barely any kind of evidence in the fossil record, but they're so weird. Completely like they could have come from outer space. So Fungus vermis is a Latinization of funky worm, which was a 1970s funk song by the Ohio Players. And you go with what you know. And our paleontology staff listen to a lot of music out in the field, and because they have such a worm-like body with no limbs, it's the monkey worm.
Well, technically, we're all space dust, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. We're all made of space stuff. Yeah.
We are at Petrified Forest National Park, as we've said several times, so we have to see a sample of petrified wood.
Oh my God, yeah, of course. A lot of people who visit the park are here to see the rainbow wood, the really colorful reds and blues and greens and all the colors that we have here, pinks and whatnot. But honestly, from paleontology and science, we're really in love with the boring brown wood. Basically because it preserves the cell structure of the tree, and that's how we describe new species of petrified wood, new species of fossil trees, other than leaves and other things that we also find here. This one in particular, that was a voucher specimen. It's our usual suspect, Araucarioxylon, which is related to monkey mussel trees. It's a conifer. However, it has this flat surface here and then these two weird bumps on either side. And what that is the remnants of a burn scar. So basically, 208 million years ago, a fire swept through our area. It was probably a fire-based ecology. The little animals that we've been talking about were living in these forests that burn over every once in a while. This side of the tree was impacted by fire, and then the tree lived to see another day, and the wood continued to expand and grow over that burn scar, just like you see in forests today. And so it's kind of cool to think that, the fire-based ecology that we see in Everglades National Park or in Yosemite or someplace like that, it was doing the same thing here 208 million years ago. Like North America is a continent of fire. Australia is like that too, right? So yeah, here it is.
And were these 208 million years ago giant trees? Is this?
Yeah, this is pretty small. We definitely get much larger trees, comparable to the pine trees that you'll see out in the world today.
When you came to this park, did you fall in love with the petrified wood, or have you always been more drawn to the dinosaur story?
No. I mean, I definitely specialized in vertebrate life throughout my career. So, the wood's a little intimidating. It's big, it's heavy, it's wood. But, it tells its own story. And so, I had to get in my mind around it. There's no flowers back then. Having cut my teeth in the Cenozoic when, we had tropical forests all over the world and all that sort of stuff, it seems kind of simple and sad compared to our modern ecosystems. But again, it is this standing on the shoulder of giants, right? Without conifers, so many of the ecosystems that are around us today, wouldn't exist, right? Like the conifer woods that stretch all around Canada and Asia and North America today. There's conifer trees like this living down through Central America, in the highlands of Nicaragua and places like that have their own unique ecosystems and things. And North Florida, where I'm from, like longleaf pine all day long, Yeah.
Is there any evidence in the park that's been brought your way where you find a vertebrate fossil inside of a petrified wood fossil?
No. People have from time to time thought they saw something in the wood. But no, we haven't found like a log that was a home to something. That's not unknown in the science of paleontology. There are these deposits of little vertebrates that have been found in sort of the casts left behind of tree hollows. So something was living in those, and then, maybe that forest was flooded by a lahar or a volcanic eruption of some sort, and or just a regular lacustrine flood along a river or something like that. And so it fills up that hollow space with sediment. Those animals die, but we haven't found that here. No.
So you have the petrified wood, but one of the really interesting things that you have in this collection is how petrified wood has been utilized in its history, and you have a perfect example of that right here.
Yeah, so definitely the peoples who first came through here, starting around 13,000 years ago, or even further back, they saw the petrified wood because the rainbow wood in particular, the really colorful stuff that people come to see today, has undergone a sort of recrystallization process that leaves it as a cryptocrystalline material, sort of like obsidian. And so just like obsidian or nice flint or chert, it can be napped into projectile points. And so this one is probably 3,000 or 4,000 years old. It's an archaic point, but it's clearly made out of the petrified wood. And we find these all over the state of Arizona. So people, as they travel through here, they may have been using obsidian from, say, California or Flagstaff or New Mexico. But when they get here, like, why carry big rocks around, right? So they use whatever materials they come across. And obviously, once it was known that this was a resource here, people, started existing and living in the park, and they were here for thousands of years, right up through today.
I've always been fascinated with how people over time have always adapted to the resources that are available to them and be able to connect with the land in such a way that they can utilize it in ways like what you just showed.
Yeah, 100%. It's sort of a hallmark of people, our species. There's not a lot of animals in this world that can exist from the globe, the poles down into the tropics. And the only way we do that is by being canny and sensitive to our environment and utilizing what we need. And here it was petrified wood.
You obviously had an interest as a kid from paleontology and then kind of grew into your role as a museum curator. After becoming a museum curator and seeing all these relics come in and artifacts, have you had a different perspective on humans and human history now that you've seen these stories told through these, arrowheads and things that you find?
100%. I think part of my love of paleontology as well, growing up in North Florida, having a poor family, was that when things at home would go off the rails and, glasses were being thrown or, like violence would break out, I would flee to the creeks where a lot of these fossils were found. And, as a kid from back east, where, our indigenous people were routed from their homes, moved halfway across the country. It was a story of depopulation by, other parts of our culture. Basically, I didn't have a connection to those stories. I didn't see a lot of the evidence, or if I did, I didn't understand it. And now having been brought here by fossils, but then surrounded by, up to the minute evidence of native people being here. I've found a humanitarian leaf that I didn't know existed in me. I always felt like humans were part of the problem, right? Like we were driving species to extinction. We were, doing things to our environment that we couldn't necessarily undo. And so seeing the human side of the story a little bit more, and try, suddenly being involved in helping people out instead of just living in my tiny world of fossils, was an eye opener, and having to collaborate with tribes and, take care of places that they've fostered through the eons for, 500 generations or more, was a big new challenge, and one that was humbling.
It's incredible, too, that we face modern day problems and we look for answers, and a lot of the answers that we find, especially in the natural world now, is going back to indigenous practices of controlled burns,
yes,
and nurturing and fostering the environment. And it's really incredible that humans today are learning from, indigenous folks who have cared for this land and learned from this land forever.
And that's one of the great things about America, right? Is we have the chance here to, grow all the time. Like we go through these periods of hubris where we're so confident that we're, on the right path. And then, we take a step back, look at, the wider picture, look at a more diverse, group of answers. And suddenly we find a more collaborative, approach, a better way of being.
Absolutely. Well, I know you have a few more items to share, one of them being a skunk that you had brought out, where I would love to learn about.
We have a lot of other little critters that we care for in the park, collections. This is a spotted skunk. What's cool to me as a curator is that when I got here, we had a person who had been studying the mammals and reptiles of the park for 20 some odd years. And, they worked at a university nearby. And for whatever reason, nobody ever showed them the museum collection. And so they gave a presentation and they were like, and we found this, and we found this, and we found this, and we found this. And it's the first record of them here, da, 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 da. And I was sitting there going, but wait, there's one of those in the collection. It's not the first record. What's going on, So after their presentation, I went, I took them aside personally. I was like, have you been in the collection? Do you know about this? And so, I brought them in and they saw a couple things that they hadn't recorded yet, including one of these skunks. And so apparently in the 1940s, this was collected in July 24th, 1943. These things were running all over the place. And there was even when we went back through our records trying to, confirm their existence here, there were stories from the superintendents and the park naturalists saying, oh my God, we're overrun by skunks. We need to do something about this. We didn't know those paper records existed. But yeah, clearly these guys were here based on this and, our archives and all that. So then I asked, I was curious, when was the last time anybody had seen one of these alive in the park? And so I asked one of our law enforcement officers who had worked here for 30 years, have you ever seen one of these? And he had seen one 8 years ago. That was in 2015, living in a culvert down at Rainbow Forest Museum. So at least one, existence, of this animal in memory, living memory. But then that begs the question, what happened? Where'd they all go? Why don't we see them on the daily? Because we do night drives all the time in the park looking for reptiles and things. Why haven't we seen one of these crossing the road? So, are they vanishingly rare? Are they, have they just moved on to better habitat? We don't know.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Is there a challenge between preserving a mammal versus a reptile or an amphibian?
Sure. Yeah. These sort of museum type mounts are very typical of museum collections for mammal skins. Reptile skins, fish skins, things like that are horrifically fragile. So more often those will just go into an alcohol solution preservative. And, in other cases, we may just preserve the skeleton, right? Because maybe when we find them, they're too far gone. And so we'll just go ahead and save a skeleton. Also, this guy is in a plastic bag with a little danger sign here because we did testing of our skins. And this is the only one that we found that was preserved with an arsenic soap. So basically, as they were skinning it, they would use this sort of arsenic-laced soap to sort of rub on the skin, and that would prevent other insects and things from eating it over time. But that means that we can't handle it safely. So that's why Danger Mouse here is living in this little bag. So I don't get harmed by it. So there is a danger to museum collections as well. In other cases, we might have a bird that hits a window while it was trying to catch another bird, like this little Cooper's hawk. And so basically, because it told a cool story, we decided to preserve it as a taxidermy mount rather than a sort of study skin where it's just, dead, laying there doing whatever. Little hands out in front of its face, and it's just a really weird position for an animal to be in. And instead, this tells more of a story, and we can combine the story of this bird with the origin of dinosaurs, which we kind of see in North America here at this park. The oldest dinosaur fossils that are easily dated in North America, there's probably older ones, are from right here. And so, of course, those dinosaurs were the, primogenitors of birds that we see around us today. So in a sense, you can say that birds have been in petrified forest longer than anywhere else in North America. So that's kind of a cool story. And we can illustrate it with a nice taxidermy mount like this for the public. But then again, when we go back to looking at our collections, here's another one of those really typical museum study skins where, like, when in life do you see a bird like this, unless maybe it's diving or napping?
And for those that are listening, these animals are almost like in plank position.
Right, yeah.
Positioned out.
yeah. They're ridiculous. Like the bat was in this weird T-pose or something like that, just ways that you would never see them. This is a beautiful little kestrel. It's a sparrowhawk. They are, becoming more rare here and in other grassland habitats because a lot of their nesting habitat and things like that is disappearing. They need standing trees, snags, and things like that. They're cavity nesters, but they love grasslands. So, things like that are things we care for. And as I was saying before, we might instead decide to skeletonize something. So I have a raven skeleton. This one fell into a cattle tank. Out on a part of the park that we acquired more recently. And there was ranching, and this continues to be ranching practices out there. But this raven had a broken arm. It healed, but maybe not well enough, and it fell into the tank and drowned. So we will conserve just the skeleton of these, and we'll use these skeletons to look at things like, remains from archaeological sites, like what were people here, 500, 1,000 years ago eating? Do the birds that we find as remains in those settlements still live on the landscape today? And things like that. So having a skeleton or two in our closets are always useful. And then if it is a kind of bird for which we don't have a good record in the park, we will work with other museums nearby to create 3D scans. And so this is a 3D scan and print of a parrot skull. People here in the park had parrots in their homes that were traded up from Central and South America. And so, we don't have good comparative collection material that we can find in the park today. But yeah, this is a 3D print of a parrot skull from the Museum of Northern Arizona. They let us borrow it, 3D scan it, and we print it out. And then if we find a parrot bone in a settlement here in the park, we can quickly compare it to something in our collection and confirm that we're right or wrong.
Well, thank you for showing all these amazing animals and fossils and artifacts. That is just a small sample of what you have in this curation. Now, when you go to other museums around the world, whether it's at national parks or just other areas in the country, are you always keeping a keen eye to how you can adjust, your own curation? Or
sure.
Do you ever have like criticism in your mind when you're going through the museum?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I spend a lot of time like looking behind exhibits, having lived this life for a while now, I've seen a lot of the things that you can see in a museum. But I'm all the time like, ducking my head underneath the dinosaurs and looking up at their armatures that hold them, their mounts, how they're, taken care of and stuff like that, just to see what I can learn through observation. Wow, how did they get that lively pose? All that sort of stuff is what I'm really obsessed with.
That's really cool. Yeah, I guess that would be another science and art is how you display them out to the public, to be able to show their personality or their charisma and what it would be like out in the natural space when they existed.
Yeah. Our lab manager and I, Deb, we work together to build armatures for the fossils we display here, or we build them for other parks and get their fossils on display for them.
So cool.
Yeah.
Well, this has been an incredible conversation. And as we begin to wind it down, I want to give you the opportunity to talk about your work or just encouragement for folks who have never been to Petrified Forest to come here, or what should they know before arriving here to help enhance their experience? Yeah.
No, I would just get familiar with the physical layout of the park, look at things before you get here online, figure out what you want to visit. We're going to be setting up a public demonstration sort of lab. They'll be open probably 2 days a week, maybe 3 if we can swing it, down at the Rainbow Forest Museum, probably in the next few months here, likely to open sometime between January and March. Myself and our lab manager, Deb, maybe seasonal, we'll be working down there, doing fossil preparation, specimen conservation, things like that, in front of the public. So you'll be able to interact with us as we do the science that we do.
Matt, this has been a lot of fun. Your work is incredible and important, and I thank you for educating the public about this amazing place, what it is today, what it used to be, and how we can all enjoy it in a way that relates to all of us. And I think your story is really special and no doubt will inspire some people who are interested in this field.
Yeah, I hope so, because I think science is ultimately accessible to everybody, who's interested. And there's nothing better than watching a kid show up at one of our public demonstrations who you watch them spark, and hopefully that's something they can bring home to their families and love that can follow them through their lives.
It's real life Legos, real life puzzles.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Well, Matt, thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Thanks for checking out this edition of the Safe Travels podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. Matt is a terrific scientific communicator, and the collections here at Petrified Forest National Park are absolutely amazing. So if you like this type of content, it'd mean a whole lot to me if you followed or subscribed on whichever platform you're watching or listening on, as it really does help out our podcast. And until next time, safe travels.